Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're all very excited to be here, and we're always excited to talk about writing and writing mysteries, which is what we all do. And I think we're going to introduce ourselves in alphabetical order with Nancy. So Nancy can go first. Yeah.
Whenever I hear that, I know I'm up, unless that's So I'm Nancy Bilyeu. I've written 5 historical novels of suspense. The first 3 were a trilogy with Simon & Schuster set in the Tudor era. Then I jumped to the 18th century and wrote The Blue, which is a story of a woman trying to discover the formula for the most beautiful shade of blue in the world, and things go wrong. And then my latest novel was Dreamland, which was a mystery set in Coney Island in 1911. So I don't write strictly murder mysteries, but there is always a murder in there. And I have to have either my main character or someone who works with her try to solve them. So that's, I think, my reason for being here.
Yeah. So Tracy, you would go next.
I'm Tracy Dehaan, and mine are traditional mysteries. So they're not necessarily cozy, but they're not, serial killer kind of books, a traditional mystery. My first books were set in Switzerland, where I lived for some time. My husband's Swiss, and it was kind of the inspiration for the character. And actually, really bad weather was an inspiration for the first book, a big ice storm that happened in Switzerland, and I lived through other ice storms in Kentucky, which is where I grew up. And so I have a couple of books set in Switzerland. Right now I'm working on one set in Kentucky, which I guess you could say I'm going from kind of my husband's roots and place to my roots and place. And my current project is set in a distillery. So a whole different kind of research when we get into talking about research. And for me, I think one of the things I begin with, obviously it's going to, in my case, it's probably going to be a murder mystery, but the sense of place is very important to me, maybe because my degree and start in professional life was as an architect. So kind of the setting, and not just the setting in terms of landscape and nature, but the whole, everything that makes that special world.
Great. So I'm going to go next. I'm Amelia Nyman, and I'm actually local to New City. I live in New City. And my debut novel came out this year. And I write about, an undercover NYPD detective who leaves the job after she works a racketeering case against the Russian mob and moves up here, basically, to a town that is not called New City, but might as well be in every way. And, when she moves here, she brings her, everything in her personal life and professional life kind of explodes. And she starts over here. And she has a teenage boy that she has with her. And after things seem to settle down, all of a sudden he disappears. So that's where I'm coming from. And I guess the book is a procedural and domestic suspense. Obviously I draw a lot on my own surroundings when I write it. And, I'll talk more about where the whole undercover thing comes from when it's time. And Elena, you're next.
Thank you. So my name is Elena Hartwell, and under that name, my first series came out, which was the Eddie Shoes Mystery Series. And I think to this day is the only mother-daughter crime-fighting duo in the mystery world. Yeah, so I'm still excited about that. Although I'd love to see more mother-daughter crime-fighting duos, because if you can't solve murder mysteries with your mom, who can you solve murder mysteries with? You can probably guess that's a little bit lighter, a little bit funnier. It is set in the Pacific Northwest. My latest book to come out, I'll Be Buried, is written under Elena Taylor. I'm often asked why the name change, and the answer is it's not funny, where the Eddie Shoes mysteries were. And so my publisher and I decided best to have it under a different name so that readers weren't confused by an expectation of having humor and having a book that's dark and atmospheric instead. And my latest book that I'm out on sub right now with my agent is straight up suspense. So I kind of have a little bit of, my hands in a couple different kinds of crime fiction. So light and funny, Private Eye, in sort of the Sue Grafton vein. Then my current book, All We Buried, which is a police procedural and is much more, it's called dark and atmospheric, is how it's been described. And then my latest novel, which is suspense, where you aren't sure if there's a crime that's been committed. Has there been a murder? As opposed to a straight up murder mystery where the murder happens right on and you're solving. It's more the question of what's actually happening here. So I sort of span those particular, and that's also set in the Pacific Northwest. So like some of the other people that have been talking, love to have that location that I'm invested in and live in, and that's part of my persona as a writer. So that's who I am. Glad to be here.
Great. So I'm going to continue going in the same circle. So Nancy. So
yes.
The thing that's always interesting to me is research. I think that's, to me, that's like one of the most rewarding aspects of writing in general, but especially writing stories where a crime is committed. So in all your books, there is some kind of crime, and some kind of crime needs to be solved. So how do you, and they're all over, they're set not where you live. So how do you so how have you done your research, and like, what is the most interesting place you went to, for example?
Well, I usually, in my plotting, I always have a female main character, and then I figure out what will be the climax, what will be the crime, and how will it be solved. And I basically have that planned. And then as I'm researching the period and the place, I look for interesting people and interesting facts to pop up, and then I start weaving them in. So, and then I start building the plot more in those directions. Like, for instance, the book that I just finished writing that's coming out next May, it's called The Fugitive Colors. It's a sequel to The Blue. It's set in London in 1764. And I found out there actually was very little crime detection or law enforcement in that period. The police were really not even a thing yet in London. It is a miracle that more people weren't murdered. And so what I found in my research is they were starting to realize that the night watch wasn't enough and a few constables running around. And so they did invent a form of police, and the man who was in charge of it, his name is Sir John Fielding. He was the brother of the man who wrote Tom Jones, and he was blind. So when I found that out, that it was a blind man who founded, and a novelist's brother who founded the London police, I had to make much more of that. So then I go in that direction. You see, because it's hard for me to build my plot out completely until I have more research. So it's kind of like a push and pull. In Dreamland, I found out that the rich people were really running the show in Coney Island in 1911, that it was a place where actually a lot of elites were going to these beautiful hotels, and they were writing their own rules. So then I moved the plot that way. So so that's kind of how I do it. I have not a skeletal idea, but I have a basic idea, and then I do tons of research. I'm online. I'm trying to get, in the case of Dreamland, I could read newspapers from that time, just researching what I can and just looking for those moments. And I just like to think, if I find something interesting, I think my readers will too, because my readers, a lot of them are kind of similar to me. And so that's my basic MO.
I'm already really interested about the blind person who's first.
He was blind, and he was leading.
It's fascinating.
Great job.
So one more thing. So you have a personal connection to the characters you've been writing about, which is kind of interesting.
You mean the Huguenot?
The Huguenot. Yeah.
Yes. Well, my main character for The Blue, I decided to make her a French Protestant refugee, and that's my background too. I'm descended from someone who came over from Europe in 1661 to what was then New Amsterdam, and later New York City, and fleeing the Catholic oppression as they saw it. And so when I decided to make a character that I then could not draw on family lore, because I don't have any lore from, those many centuries ago, but I have an interest. And so I started to build on that. And also I live in Woodstock, and I'm not that far from New Paltz. And this is actually an area, even though this is the American wing of it, there's a lot of very rich history and background to the Huguenots in Hudson Valley. So it's sort of coming together, and
Yeah.
I think that people like it when you base a character not so much on yourself necessarily, but if you have some sort of personal stake or personal interest that you're building on, I think it gives my writing a little more direction or special passion in that area. And I think people pick up on it. I hope they do. And that they
Yeah, absolutely. So Tracy, I want to start backwards. I want to start with the distillery. And I want to know how that research is coming along.
Well, it's interesting. I don't remember when I first had an idea about writing a character that might have something to do with the distillery. How sometimes you have a little niggle of an idea that just is kind of a vague thing. I did grow up in Kentucky, and I spent many of my years in Lexington, which is in the central part of the state. And we were there when there was a kind of transformation. Elena will appreciate this, that the World Equestrian Games came to Lexington, Kentucky. It was a big deal. It's the first time it had not been in Europe or the Far East. Actually, it may have been the first time it was not in Europe. So it was a huge deal. My husband was involved in bringing them there. And that opened up tourism. The whole city needed to prepare for tourism at a kind of global scale. And so it went from being a couple of distilleries that, sure, we'd been to visit when we were in college or just out of college, to a kind of an industry that needed better signage and more connectivity. And so I think that planted the seed in my mind that this was something of great interest to people. It was something that people like to come and visit and see. There's a historical aspect. Lots of people go tour distilleries who have no interest in any sort of bourbon, but it's like any other sort of something, the roots of a community. And so I was interested in the buildings. I was interested in all the things that go with the bourbon, even more so than the bourbon itself. And I thought that would be a real draw for someone coming back to Kentucky.
Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of where that started. Now the research is interesting because I'm sure, as all of you know what you don't know until you start research. So I was very, very fortunate to reach out to some people in Kentucky. I live in Southwest Virginia now, so I'm kind of over the mountain from Kentucky, and reached out to a group called Bourbon Women, and a big organization with roots in Louisville, but spread out across the country. And they very kindly, some of them, we started emailing, we met in person. One of the women, her father is now retired, but he was a master distiller for a very significant distillery. She's in the industry. And I'm almost embarrassed at how little I really knew. And these were just kind people who were willing to take me into their home, spend time with me, take me to distilleries. We've had follow-up phone calls where they talk for 2 hours, and I'm recording because I can't take notes fast enough. And so I got this wealth of information. And from that, I was able to say, these are the little bits I'm going to use. As you all know, you use like 5% of what you end up learning.
That makes me want to write about a distillery.
I think you are also looking for what's appropriate, whether it's in time, like, you can't use the police, like Nancy was saying, you have to go a different way. And so when I was writing about Switzerland, I needed a way to kill somebody that wasn't a gun, because that was not going to be very believable there. My dad's actually on this call, so he was the inspiration for that. He's a retired physician. Mm-hmm. And so my very first murder victim, an homage to my father, who in the emergency room had someone who had been stabbed in the back with an ice pick.
Wow, that's like in real life that happened.
And he, was able, just kind of randomly, telling us about this later, probably, how the person said they didn't actually feel it. It I guess, I don't know, the pain is so acute. So that inspired my first method of murder. But then coming to Kentucky and looking at distilleries, you're like, it's going to be a whole different atmosphere because it's a different place.
Because
So
it's a different
research.
Different rules. So when you were writing in Switzerland or about Switzerland, did you also reach out to the police there?
So my husband is Swiss, and the joke in Switzerland is that if you go through the phone book, every 10th name is a policeman. It's a very safe society, perhaps because there are so many policemen. And also they're really rule abiders in many ways. And so we were very fortunate. One of his very good friends, brother, was a policeman. So I was able to reach out to people. And I think even, it's a traditional mystery. It's not heavy police procedural. And I'm trying to think of, corollaries. I think someone like Elizabeth George, when she writes, it's not down in the nitty gritty of the autopsy room or the detective's files. It's really about the people and the police, whether they're the working the beat or whether they're higher up in the police force, and kind of their personal interior life and how they're interacting with the public and with this crime. So I wasn't so much into the nuance of, exactly how would that meeting be held at police headquarters, for example. But absolutely, I did reach out. And as you all also know, when you ask people how to do something, there is no such thing as absolute truth, because people do have opinions, or, in my town, they would do it this way, and this town, they would do it that way. We know that in the United States, different regions, the state police would step in, other places, the sheriff, it's the local police. And in Switzerland, I did have a kind of a fictional town where my crime occurred. And so I got to make my police station, kind of a fictional, and it was borrowed from a certain region in Switzerland, but that's not something that's going to behave the same all over the country.
So I'm just curious, like when you wrote it, did you get like anybody, because sometimes read it, people who read your book will read it because they're really familiar with that subject. Like, did you ever have anybody say, oh, you got that, you really got that right?
I have had people reach out from Switzerland, and the biggest thrill for me when my book came out was we were flying through Switzerland and my book was for sale at the airport in Zurich. And I literally we were on a flight to India. So Zurich was halfway there. So it was already an 8-hour, 9-hour flight. We were in the airport for a couple of hours. And Henry said, I think that's your book. And he's like, it's around the corner on the wall. And I went around the corner and I looked, I'm like, I don't see it. He's like, well, not that wall, the other wall. And when I saw it, I actually thought, I think I'm so tired and jet lagged, I'm hallucinating. It didn't seem real. And
did you take a picture? Did you take a selfie?
Oh yeah, total selfie, and talk to the bookseller. It was a lot of fun. Yeah. But it's interesting, little things like words we use. I mean, do you say soda or pop, and that kind of thing when you're writing in a book that's set in a foreign country, it's even one step farther away that, you have to say, what's the right thing to call your parents? What's the right way to refer to something, this or that. And there's always 5 opinions for every question.
Right. Right. So I guess I'm next since we're going alphabetically. So my research was actually done in my living room because I'm married to an NYPD detective who used to work on the cover, and he worked the racketeering case that was very similar to the racketeering case I wrote about, except that his case was with a different kind of mob. But I felt, so I'm Russian, I'm from Russia. And I'm like, well, I can't write about the mob he worked with because I don't know anything about them. I could write about Russians. So that was actually a lot of fun for me because you can just write anything about Russians and it will sound authentic because they will just, if it's not nailed down, they'll put it on the black market. I mean, when the Soviet Union disbanded, there was an American Russian who was like part of the Russian mob, whose nickname was Tarzan, who ended up brokering a deal to steal a submarine, like it could have been a nuclear sub, but he was like, no, we don't really need a nuclear sub, which is like a regular sub, a submarine from the ex-Soviet army, and sell it to the cartel so that they could transport cocaine under the water. So that's the kind of stuff that the Russian mob does. And I was like, I can't like pass up the opportunity to write about them. And also, it gave me the opportunity to write about Brighton Beach, which is, I didn't live there, but I spent a lot of time there growing up. And the food was great, so I got to write about the food. And it's weird, like I chose stuff to write about that I kind of wanted to be in myself, because, if I set it in Coney Island or Brighton Beach, I could kind of like picture myself being there. And a lot of the stuff I actually sat down with my husband and I had him walk me through the procedural elements. I was like, okay, you're on the street, you're undercover, you're pretending to be a drug addict. How do you buy drugs? Step by step. And he took me through it step by step. I was like, all right, then you have the drugs, you come back to the precinct, then what happens? And he took me step by step, how to voucher, all of that. He even went so far as to like, he started doing the research for me. He's like looking things up online. He's like, okay, these are the kits that we use to test the drugs, because apparently, this is a great detail. If you buy drugs, right, the person who sells it to you is guilty of, obviously selling drugs. But if they sell you bad drugs, in other words, they're not really drugs, it's like, baby laxative, they're also guilty of robbing you. So it's like, so you have to test, yeah, how awesome is that? So you have to like test the drugs and make sure they're actually drugs. Otherwise you can add an extra charge. So I learned all of these wonderful and awesome things. And then the other part of my book is I have a teenage boy in it, and part of the book is written from his point of view. And he's a Boy Scout. And, at the time, my son is still a teenager, but at the time my son was in the Boy Scouts. And if any of you listening have kids in the Scouts, they're like MacGyvers. You can put your scout into like pretty much any situation, and there's a badge for getting out of that situation. So almost anything I did to this kid, all I had to do is look up and see, would he have learned how to deal with this in the Boy Scouts? And sure enough, there was a badge for whatever it is I wanted to happen to him. So that level of research was actually that was fun. It was great. And Elena, you're next.
So I love research. Research is one of my favorite aspects of being a writer. And I do a lot of different kinds of research, like everyone. I read nonfiction books. I have a ton of books on forensics and police procedures and how to be a PI. And, I have information about how autopsies are done and what the medical examiner does. So I have all that sort of background research. But my favorite way to research is to interview experts. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, sometimes what's out there in a manual is not what happens in the real world. Like, sometimes I might go to I have a homicide detective in particular who's been involved with me on every single book. And I'll go to him and say, here's how I understand it. And he'll be like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do, but that's not how it works in the real world. So my very favorite part is to interact with an expert. And that is across the board, whatever I'm looking at, because as we all know, even when you're writing a police procedural, which All We Buried really is, and I have a lot of police procedure in my private investigator series as well, even when that's the heart of the book and you're researching a murder and an investigation, there's all these other things that you also need to know. For example, say you have a character who's got a minor role, but they're a chef. Well, you need to know, like, what time does that person go to work and what is their language? How do they talk about things? How many people work for them? How big is the restaurant? There's details about every character, regardless of the role that they play or whether or not that's even part of a murder investigation. So I will interview, not just police officers, medical examiners, private investigators, and people on the criminal, research side, but I might check with a master gardener about a particular flowering plant. Will this really flower in this, season in this particular area? Or I might check with an individual simply because they live in a particular area. Hey, like something was mentioned, do you say soda, do you say pop, right? Like getting language right and dialogue right. So I might be checking with someone from a particular region. And so I find that in person, face to face, and I have been doing them over Zoom for the last 18 months, like everyone else. I find that the best. And I've always found, before I was a novelist, I was a playwright, and I still did a lot of research. I've always loved doing research. And I have found over the last 2 decades that no one ever says no to talking about the things that they are passionate about. And so I've never, the one and only time I have ever had someone say no to me. My third novel is set in part in a casino, and I wanted to do some research on security. And I went to our local casino, and I went in, and the guy at the door, and I explained I was a novelist. And I brought other books to be like, I really am a novelist, like proving who I am, and want to talk to security. He said, oh yeah, let me go get our head of security. I'm sure he'll want to talk to you. And it's gone a really long time. He finally comes back out, and the guard comes over to me and he goes, he won't come talk to you. And I said, well, why is that? He says, he has to assume you're here to case the joint. He has to assume that you are here to find the flaws in our security, and he will not come talk to you. And then he kind of leans over, he looks around, he goes, but I'll answer your questions. So, yeah, right? Like crazy. And so, but one of the things that I realized in that, besides the fact that I now had this guard that I could get answers from, was this was going to be an area that almost no readers would know if I made stuff up. Because unless you are in that particular inner circle, you're not going to know how it works, because that's how closed mouth they are. But in all my years of research and interviewing, it is the one and only time I have ever had someone turn me down. And actually turning me down showed me what I needed to know, which was I could make stuff up and no one was going to know it, because they don't talk about what they do. So that's my absolute very favorite part. And my police officer and I, the guy that I have the most interactions with, I call him my cop. My cop, we have a deal, which is I have the always, never, sometimes rule. And so I'll write the novel, I write the draft, I go back through and I flag all of the and I do this for every expert I'm going to talk to. I go through and I flag every place where I want to confirm I have something accurate. And I go to him and I just walk through the manuscript. Okay, here's this scenario. Do I have this right? Here's this scenario. Do I have this right? How's the language here? Et cetera, et cetera. And it's always, never, sometimes. So yes, we would always do that. Okay, have to have that in. We would never do that. Okay, how can I rewrite this to be accurate? And if he says, yeah, we might do that, or we sometimes do that, I can keep it because I can legitimately use it. So that's my scale with every expert when I go back through always, never, sometimes to say whether I can keep something in or I need to tweak it. So that's, yeah, I do a ton of research before, during, and after. Love it. Love it.
That's cool. So how do you find the people? Like, how'd you find your cop?
So my cop, who's also handsome and charming, like I just hit the jackpot with him. And he's got writers in the family and very supportive. I went into nearby, my town actually doesn't have a police department, it's small enough, but I went into the local police department not too far away. And I went into the secretary and I said, I'm a novelist and I need to run some stuff past a homicide detective. Do you have somebody that would be interested? And she said, I will put out a note and find out who wants to talk to you, and they will reach out to you. And not a day later, I get an email from him. He's like, hey, I'm happy to talk to you. And we've been meeting ever since. And I meet with him multiple times for a book that has a lot of police procedure. So multiple times on all the PI books, and quite a lot for the actual police procedural, All We Buried. We had a lot of communication. But even on my current suspense, there's a little bit where I needed to know some stuff. And so I would touch base with him on that as well. But, we might meet after first draft, second draft, third draft, and, even while I'm finishing up final polishes. So he's always been incredibly generous, but I've always done it that way. I call people up, or I email them, or I walk in their office. Like I walked into the casino, or I reached out to the coroner, the medical examiner for Kittitas County, and just said, hey, can I run some questions by you? Faculty at universities, everybody's always been just terrific about responding.
Wow, I'm inspired now. Because usually I'm just like so timid. I'm like, I can't.
People love to talk about their areas of expertise.
And that's true. That is
and they want you to get it right. I think the really important thing to remember is they want you to get these details right. They don't want you misrepresenting what they do.
Oh, you're totally right. I don't know why I'm scared. So I think we can ask questions.
I actually have a question. I'm going to put the rest of you, while people in the audience may be thinking of those. Have you ever found that there is something that is true and accurate, but it is a detail that the general public is going to think, well, I don't believe that? And I'll give you an example. My distillery is supposed to be relatively new. So it has an owner and it has kind of 2 employees. And I had a beta reader go, really? I mean, that's not possible. And I'm like, oh yeah, ask a lot of distillery owners. Not everybody is, Maker's Mark and Jack Daniels and all this kind of thing. And so I think you have to make sure that the reader believes it, even though it's true, because it goes against what they think. Have you all run into that?
Yeah, you know what? I have a 2-part answer to that. The first is I actually had that with a student I was working with. He had written a short play, wonderful short play. He was a retired doctor and had come back to college, and I was his instructor. And he had written about a character who was a Vietnam vet, and the vet in the story in Vietnam had a lot of experience. And I was like, this doesn't quite ring true, because he wouldn't be old enough to have had all this experience. And he goes, but Elena, this is based on my life. And I said, but you were not the norm in this situation, and we talked it through. And finally he was like, well, he didn't quite believe me. So we put it out in front of audience members, and audience members were like, wait a minute, could he be that age? And the guy's sitting there going, but this is my real life. And I said, it doesn't matter. If the bulk of your audience is not going to believe it, you have to, on some level, you're going to be better off writing a little bit to expectations. So that was this really wonderful experience where like all the students in the class went, oh, we get it now, why, what that means. But the funny thing that has happened to me was, so I have a little bit of a mafia show up in Bellingham, Washington in the first book. And I had somebody from Bellingham who was like, love the book, great, really fun, really entertaining, but there would never ever be mafia in Bellingham like this, that's not accurate. And I had a little moment of like, I have this wacky mom character who's a card counter, been kicked out of Vegas, shows up there, she's fighting crime with her daughter. Like, I think we can have a little suspension of disbelief with this particular series. Like, this is not total realism. And so there is also that little bit of juxtaposition, I think, of like how realistic All We Buried is. Very realistic, man. I nailed all of I knew I had to nail the police stuff and get that right. But with Eddie's Shoes, which is light and funny and comedic, it was like, oh, I think it's okay that I've got mafia in Bellingham, which, a lot of drugs run through there. So also not out of the realm of possibility, but that's one of the places where that has shown up in my experience.
I find that if you write like really, really authoritatively, people just like assume you know what you're talking about. And they'll be like, okay, like the things people objected sometimes to me was not any of the procedural stuff, like none of that. It was more like, would the mom actually say that? Or like, would the teacher say that? I'm like, well, really? That's like that my fictional characters are saying something. You know?
I think that's proof you've written so well, though, because they're so invested in the
Right.
character, right? I think that's actually a real compliment.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, I've run across some crazy, seeming implausible, real people in the times that I'm sending my books, and I like to put real people in my books. My characters are fictional, but sort of surrounded by some real people. So the one I've just finished, there was a man living in 1764 in London who's a French aristocrat who was a master spy, who was one of the best fencers in Europe, who for half his life dressed as a woman and passed as a woman.
Yeah.
The Chevalier Dehaan. And I put him in the book because my book's about spycraft in this very fevered time in European history. And I thought, people are going to think I'm being sort of, what am I trying to say here? And so I tried to give him some context, and I mentioned and had my character react to cross-dressing balls that were very popular then, to show that there was actually a lot of cross-dressing. And this is the dangerous liaison period in Europe, and there was a Catherine the Great had a lot of cross-dressing balls. But also, I'll have to tell you, I also took the coward's way out too. And in my author's note at the end, I mentioned who's real and who isn't, and I mentioned him. Just in case you think I'm like being salacious or something, just for entertainment sake. This was a real person. He was one of the best fencers in all of Europe, and dressed as a woman and passed as a woman, and he was a man.
That's one of my favorite parts, though, of historical fiction, when in the end you get to, and in fact, often I know that there are real characters incorporated. I'll flip to the end just to kind of make sure I don't miss any of them, because it's fun.
Good. Yeah. I try to help out a little there.
Yeah, I end up doing that while I'm reading historical fiction. So while I'm reading, I'm like, I have to look this up. What is that? So
I wanted to say one more thing about Amelia in Russia. I'm very interested in Russia, and my favorite show, I was addicted to The Americans on TV. And once in a while I would bug her and I'd say, did you see this episode? Was his Russian good in that scene? It wasn't that good.
well, I mean, it's true. Like, you can always tell when it's like an American actor.
Yeah.
Or when it's a Russian actor. Like
I felt like I had an added value to my watching of Americans and Amelia the next day.
Yeah. But the motivations on the Americans were spot on, I have to say.
KGB, deep implant.
Yeah. So, okay, so now I guess we could take questions. If anybody has any questions.
I can ask something. I have also done research for writing at different times of my life. Do you ever worry if the CIA got a hold of your Google search? Would you be uncomfortable?
Not me, but Amelia's going down. I mean,
I'm totally going down.
she is.
I'm totally going down. I've downloaded the Anarchist Cookbook, which you're not. I think you're not allowed to have. And I'm sure me saying this right now probably put me on yet another list.
I think we have a copy at the library, believe it or not. I don't.
Oh, really?
I don't think it's as banned as it used to be. But
Well, that's so they can check and see who checks it out, so they can follow that person.
No, I will tell you, public libraries, when the Freedom of Information Act passed in 2001, we started deleting our records. So when you check a book back and it disappears from your record, you can request to have a history taken, but we have no records to provide if asked for a history of checkouts.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, that's kind of fascinating.
You are free to get your grossest, bloodiest books that you want, and no one will know.
See, that's the
a lot of privacy
fact that now has to go into crime solving. Somebody,
right? I love that. I will say it does cross my mind sometimes when I think about what my search history looks like, because, it's, I always tell my husband, if anything bad ever happens to him, like I am so going to be, people are going to think I'm guilty, because it's like, murdering people without leaving a mark, and what kind of poisons are not picked up by the police. And, so I do every once in a while, it does cross my mind of like, there's things in my search history that I would not want the police to dig into. It does cross my mind.
Well, I once spent like an entire day researching how long does it take to dissolve a body.
Yes.
And what
right?
do you need to use to dissolve it?
How
And
much
to-
how much lie does it take?
Yeah, and I had like in the story, it had to happen within like 5 or 6 hours. So I'm like, can it be done in 5 or 6 hours?
I think
So we've got a couple questions that have popped up that
Rose asked, can I have the results of a trial without writing the action of a trial?
yes,
absolutely.
read Michael Connolly, John, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, trials are dull. So, there are writers who write wonderful action-packed, trial thrillers. But the reality is you don't need to have the trial at all. That can be, it's in the story, but not the plot. And the plot just has the outcome of the trial. Absolutely.
Let's say the runaway jury did the job. I think everyone else can take a break from writing trials, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Deborah asked, enjoying the conversation, can you talk more about your process for plotting twists?
Okay, shall we go in alphabetical order again?
I have to think
Go,
about
Nancy.
it. Somebody else go first.
I think it's going to depend on plotter versus pantser. I'm kind of in between. So I, in my mind, I know how I want the book to begin. It may change when you get to a final draft, and I know where it's going to end. And I actually know who committed the crime. And so I have that in my mind. And often the exact ending changes. And then I'll know kind of in the story arc, maybe the major plot point, the first one. And then I might know how it's going to hit the climax. But then when you're talking about the twists, for me, that comes out of the secondary characters that come in. And so some of that is as you do that, you have your first draft, and then you see a character that you think, wow, this person could have more of a role, or maybe a bit of a conversation takes it in a different path. Even though you're writing both halves of the conversation, sometimes the actual words, you see something in that and you think there's a different way to interpret this. This could lead to a twist. So I think I'm a little bit, there's a plot, but the twists come through the evolution of the drafts.
Mine is similar. And I, as a side note, I'm on a personal crusade to get people to stop using the term pantser because I hate it. I like organic writers, because pantsers, exactly what you said, Tracy, we know we've done work in our head. We just haven't created an outline, but we've done work in our head. We know where it's ending. We know where it starts. We have an idea of scenes. We just don't necessarily create some big sort of outline. The idea that we sit down to a blank page with nothing in our mind, I think discounts the amount of work that we do mulling on the story. So I'm on a personal crusade to get us all to use organic rather than pantser. But I totally agree with you, Tracy. Like for me, when I'm creating a plot, like the plot is coming out of the actions of the characters, right? The plot is coming from what my characters do, and what my characters do is coming out of who they are, right? So are they brave? Are they scared? Are they, someone who's going to plunge headlong in without thinking, or are they going to be really thoughtful and methodical? And out of that is their next action, and then the reaction, and how that impacts the world that I've created. And so, they're making mistakes, and that creates a plot twist. Or a new character walks in the door, and that creates a plot twist. Or we find out something they thought was true, right? And it's their reaction to that, which is building that plot and building that character. And so like the amount of twists is totally different between a first draft and a fourth draft and a 10th draft and a 50th draft, because I have it outlined and these things are being revealed. But I think, and I don't know if you others are outliners, and I'd love to know that, like that the outline, there's still the process of creating the outline. And in that creative process, you're discovering the twist. You just do it in an outline form rather than prose on the page. Mm-hmm. Nancy, have you come up with your answer now?
Most of my twists come in the outline. And one thing that I've had to really push myself to do that in the beginning I was bad at. My first novel took me 5 years on and off to write, and I just have always had trouble with having really bad things happen to my main character. I want to protect them, in a way. So I shy away from really terrible, but even when I read a book, when very high stakes, dangerous, and emotionally fraught things are happening, I get very vested. I want to know what's going to happen. So I know it's important. And I know that I like it in my fiction. But as a writer, I have to, so that's part of my pushing myself. And a lot of the twists are when something's revealed that is really going to be bad. So it's really, I think, twist is one way to convey it, but it's just something that I work hard on, because I think that for a lot of people who are just getting started in writing fiction, you shy away a little bit from going for it and having your character put in like the worst possible thing happening to your characters. But you just have to, and in my case, I just have to really push myself, because that's what a really memorable novel is going to be about.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I feel like maybe the question, so I think people think of different things when they say twist, because sometimes it means, oh, the person who did it is totally not who you expected, right? So if any of you have read The Plot, which I just finished reading, it's one of those where it's pretty great plot, but there is a twist in it, and the twist revolves around, kind of who's responsible for the crime. But it kind of also comes with it bringing danger to the main character. So for me, I find both of those that's my Kilimanjaro. So yeah, I'm still working on getting that stuff right.
I mean, I like twists. Sometimes as a reader, I do feel I admire what the writer's done, but I feel, like when it's in the first person, it turns out that this person who you've been encouraged to invest in and like is actually murdering people. You just haven't been in that scene yet. It's been, and a lot of people are doing it, and God bless. I don't judge, but I just find that as a reader, I feel a little tricked. It's like me in movies, I don't like with the movie Jagged Edge, where Jeff Bridges, is the killer. Spoiler alert. But you see him spreading the ashes of his dead wife, looking sad off the boat. That's like, no, that was really messing with us, because it wouldn't have been sad, So I have this sort of purist streak where I don't like to be completely tricked in a way that I don't think is fair. But at the same time, I admire the cojones of the writer.
Right.
Yeah, Nancy, I totally agree with you. And I would say that, one of the things I love about whatever you want to call it, a twist or a character reveal, is I love when a layer is shown to me I haven't seen yet of a character. And I love when it's a surprise, but I have to be able to say, oh, the clues were there and I didn't see it. I have to feel that it legitimately comes out of what's been revealed before. And I agree with you. If it doesn't, I feel tricked, and that pisses me off.
Well, the way to do it right is so the reader gets there before the character, right? Both the character and the reader can't be surprised at the same time, right? So if the reader gets there like 20 pages before, then there's 20 pages for the reader to like mentally scream at the main character. Like, what are you doing? Don't you know? And the writers who can do it well are pretty amazing, because especially if they do it from a single point of view, and the entire story is from a single point of view, and yet somehow something is communicated to the reader that is missed by the main character. That's pretty brilliant. And if you can get that balance, I'll bow down. So Tracy, you were kind of quiet on this subject, but so
No, I kind of agree with everybody. I think we have another great question.
Yeah.
That if a book is told from multiple points of view, would an outline be more beneficial? Kind of going back to the outline. And, it's funny. I was just talking to somebody about this the other day about multiple points of view and deciding, do you really need all those points of view? Obviously, if you have two, you probably have decided and committed. But if you get into more than three, you're getting into a lot of points of view. Do you need all of them? Who does the story need to be told from? And I can see where if you wrote that and then you realize you didn't need them, that you could have benefited from an outline. Like, what do you need in the story and who is the best storyteller? That an outline might be helpful there. Ken Follett, who was, of course, very famous for writing thrillers, that usually had 2 points of view, maybe 3 points of view.
Yeah.
In his success. And then when he decided to kind of, go off the ranch and write Pillars of the Earth, which became his most successful book and spawned its own little series, he said he did an incredibly intricate outline of that book in a way that he had never done for his other books. And part of it was because he had, many more points of view, and that he knew that he would waste too much time writing and he would probably never finish the book. So maybe a little bit has to do with the scale and scope of the book.
Yeah, and I would add in, Tracy, I totally agree with what you said. And I would also add, I would frame it in a slightly different way, which is if you're an outliner, then you need to outline. And if you're not an outliner, then it's not going to help you unless there's a particular project that lends itself and you feel compelled to. But I think that, in my experience, this is coming from as an educator, and having worked with a ton of writers as a teacher and as a developmental editor. And so it's not just my own experiences, but what I see in other people, which is you can't force a process on a writer that doesn't suit them. And so if somebody truly is an organic writer and works things out in prose on the page, saying, hey, you got to outline, it doesn't fit, and they're going to sort of brace against it, and it's not going to flow, and it's going to feel very, stilted what comes out. And simultaneously, somebody who really needs to outline as part of their process, if they're told, hey, just sit down and freeform, it's not going to work either. So I'm not saying people can't try it and maybe find that some combination. I tend to outline after I've written a first draft. So I write a first draft organically and then outline later to figure out what's missing or if I need to move things around. I'm not saying there aren't ways to figure out what works for you, but I think the question is what works for you as a writer on this particular project.
I agree.
I agree. So I know the question was, if you have multiple POVs, would an outline help? But the real question is, or actually the real answer is that, it actually doesn't, the outline is not gonna make it better, make the story better. You just have to, you're gonna outline if you outline, like Elena says, or you write it the way you write it. But the thing with multiple POVs is that each point of view has to move the story forward. You can't just do it because you feel like you want to explore a character or show a character. You have to like, okay, this is the story. And each chapter, each scene moves it forward. And if you need the multiple POVs to move it forward, then you have them. And if it's not necessary to move the story forward, then you have to ask why do you have them in there? But obviously there's definitely authors who do it very well. And the one that always comes to mind is Stephen King, who has many multiple POVs, and he has an omniscient narrator most of the time. And for him, it just works because he knows what he's doing,
I mean, I always write in first person. I would kind of like to try multiple point of view, and I've been thinking about it. For me to just do third person is a big deal. But my fear or my hesitance in doing multiple points of view is that it's really important to me to have those emotional stakes that the character's going through. And I don't know if I'm capable or if anybody would want to go through having multiple stakes and emotions, especially if, in a thriller or mystery, another point of view might be the antagonist. So I don't know if I'm ready to wait the emotional needs of the antagonist and then have the protagonist over here. I mean, maybe I don't have the skill yet to do this, but I'm just not sure. But that's kind of the reason why I stick with one person, because I feel like I have competing emotional arcs, and it might be just too hard.
Well, actually, that's an interesting question, because for Elena, you're right. A procedural, I'm writing procedurals. So you have, your detective and you have a crime. But I find it also really interesting to write from the point of view of the detective who's solving the crime, and there's the procedural part going on there.
Right.
But I also really, really like writing from the point of view of the person who is either committing the crime or to whom the crime is happening or has happened. Like, to me, that's really, really interesting. So, and that part is more emotionally fraught usually. So
Right.
how do you find that? Or do you how does that, how do you balance that,
Well, I think it's so dependent on any particular project. So, for example, I have a novel that's told in 2 different time periods with multiple point of view, and it's because the story lent itself to that. It was, I didn't want to talk about history, I wanted to show it. And so that character is in their own time in the present, everything's in the present. It's just 2 different timelines happening simultaneously. And that there's a police officer, a sheriff in that one. And I wanted his perspective balanced out in our present with the young woman whose life is being upended by the crime. And so I have her point of view and his point of view. Then I go in, the series, the timeline, which happened prior, and that's in her point of view. And so that book lent itself to that. But my funny PI series, I didn't need to have multiple timelines and multiple point of view. It's my point, it's that very classic private eye, first person, doesn't need it. And so it's so dependent on the project. I think that you're writing.
I agree.
Yeah, I had the experience. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say we have another great question, but go ahead and finish, Tracy.
I was going to say that, and back to kind of, do you plan it? I'm more of the organic writer, and then I like to do the outline and take a step back.
Yeah.
And in my first book, Swiss Vendetta, I had, it was all drafted out. In fact, it was sold to St. Martin's Press. And, the only thing my editor said as acquiring it and it's going to be published, she said, we might just do a little bit of a balance of characters and have a little bit less of this character. And she goes, to kind of make up the word count, you could just add a little bit more to your main character, who was the investigating officer. And, I'm new, it's my first book. I'm like, well, are there scenes you want cut? Or do you want me to just trim, like literally trim, go through and like cut out words that are unnecessary? And she said, that would be fine. She said, there's no scenes that I don't like. It's just maybe to trim it a little bit. Okay. And fortunately, I took a good hard look at that. And I thought, that just doesn't feel right to me. And so I was able to look at the character that needed to be minimized a little bit. And then my character that needed to, have more stuff as the star. And there was a whole other character that was interacting with the first one that needed to be trimmed. And I thought, well, just get rid of that person. Like, what are they really doing?
Yeah.
They're a foil for that other character. Let me get rid of them. So then every single thing that I need that secondary character to do, I literally highlighted, like literally the words that had to be in the book, the plot points, whatever. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have to bring my main character into the scene with them. So I did have to rewrite quite a few scenes so that I was balancing it by actually bringing them together and getting rid of someone. I don't know that I could have seen that in the outline. I think I would now, but it is that organic way of massaging and making those changes that you can't necessarily predict.
And I actually think more books that I've read might have benefited from a similar treatment sometimes. It works to make things tighter.
So Sheila asked in the chat, before the event ends, what's one piece of advice that you would each give to an aspiring author?
Are we going alphabetically? Nancy, you got one you're ready with?
Reverse order. In reverse.
Go in
You
reverse.
think I would have like, dazzling wisdom ready. I mean, my first book was published almost 10 years ago, and yet I still feel like I'm learning a lot as I go. I think that the most important thing is to pace yourself, because it is really important to get your first book out there. But then, you really do need to think about what your goal is. Do you want to have a body of work? Do you want to have a series? I just feel like in our business, everybody thinks about getting that first book, getting the first deal. And then when that happens, your life will be perfect. And, if you want to be a novelist and like I feel like as I go, my storytelling, I'm learning and from other people and pushing myself a lot, that I think that you need to, get out of that Cinderella thing. And I wish somebody could have told me that with that whole debut thing, that, to look beyond it and what you really want to do. What kind of pace do you want to set for yourself?
I agree with that. I would add, find a community of, fellow writers so that you can learn some of those things, because I think that if you're around people who are, near where you are and then farther out, you start to say, oh, that's, they have lessons that you can learn from. And there are organizations, obviously, locally, there are writers groups and things. And I often think sometimes a writers group is more about literally writing or having a buddy to write with. And then larger organizations, I'm very involved with Sisters in Crime. Elena is very involved with International Thriller Writers. There are many great writing organizations that offer, ongoing kind of support and a place to have a question about, has anybody ever done this? Has anybody ever gone through a redesign of a cover? Has anybody ever whatever? And also have ongoing classes on craft. And a lot of those are recorded and you can listen to them again. But it's a place to be legitimately in contact with people you would not normally run into and have a forum to ask questions. So that would be a piece of advice.
Yeah, and like for me, it was invaluable to actually take workshop classes, because I don't know how anybody can get good at writing without feedback, and without feedback from, like basically professional writers. And the one place I always recommend to everybody is the Gotham writers classes. And actually, Nancy and I met.
Yeah, that's where we met.
So I can't recommend those enough. And I mean, they are kind of for like the beginning stage of learning, because they're kind of meant for that. They're meant to kind of nurture. But they do it very, very well, and a lot of the instructors are very good. And you learn how to read other people's work, and you learn how to write in such a way to affect other people the way you want them to be affected, and you just basically learn. And I second what everybody else said. If you join, if you write mysteries, join Mystery Writers of America. If you write, definitely join International Thriller Writers, Sisters in Crime, because they do have these webinars, and they'll have, professional published authors kind of share their wisdom, and it's all useful. And I might add, meetup.com has writing groups that you could join, and I highly recommend those, because unfortunately it no longer happens, but there was one right here in Nyack that was invaluable to me, and I was in it for like almost 3 years, and I loved it. But COVID was the end of that. But yeah, absolutely join a writing group.
I mean, I would even add to what Amelia just said. We were on an email chain with a mutual friend who, there's this term called beta readers, where you have somebody read your book in beta form, before you send it to an agent or an editor or whomever. Does anybody do that? And, it made me think about, because I do believe in workshopping and classes and readers, and it's not because I'm writing by committee or anything. It's because I started it, I'm actually a magazine editor. And when I started to do storytelling. I first did screenplays. And when I am coming up with a story, it's a movie in my head. And then when I write it, it's still the movie in my head, but it's not necessarily the right movie on the page for someone else. And so what I really want from, frankly, Amelia, who's my writing buddy, but other people too, is I want to know, because this is for other people. When you read this, are you reading what's happening as far as pace, character, and so forth? And I think it's really important to find out, to have other people read your work with a constructive but critical eye and let you know how close your book is to the movie in your head. So
Exactly.
sort of bridge that gap.
And my advice is very simple. Don't rush, know when to stop. The biggest mistakes I see writers make, even some that are experienced, is rushing to submit. The work's not polished, the query's not ready, the synopsis isn't finished. They haven't done exactly what Nancy's just talking about. They haven't gone through beta readers. They haven't, they haven't polished up, and they want to rush to query, rush to get it out there. And you're never going to get published that way. You want to have your, we know in the industry that it's getting harder and harder to get published because there are more and more people submitting, and editors want almost perfect from the agent, so agents want almost perfect from the writer, in a way that wasn't true even a few years ago. And so have your work polished, have it finished, don't rush it, get that work done. But then at some point, stop rewriting, stop having people read it, stop getting feedback, commit, send out your queries, see what happens. If it doesn't sell, reassess, maybe you need to rewrite, maybe your query's not quite working, but you have to have those parameters. Don't rush, but at one point you've got to stop tweaking, and you have to put it out there if you want to be published, because that's part of the process.
And
rush, but know when to stop.
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing. And what I see sometimes from, people who end up like not succeeding is that they sit there and they polish the first chapter, and they polish it for like a year, and don't do that. Just write like a disgusting draft from beginning to end. Don't worry about words. When you're done with that first draft, step back, then re-outline. And then you can write a second draft where you rearrange things, add a character, take out a character, whatever you have to do. Still don't polish it. I would say don't polish it until your third draft. By the time you get to the third draft,
or 20th,
or 20th, right,
or 100th,
right.
There's no shame.
Yeah, start polishing, but just get off the beginning. Like I can't tell you how many people I've come across who just are stuck on the beginning forever, and they never leave it. And that makes no sense. That's like if you're doing a painting of a full body and you're doing like you're drawing eyelashes, and you start with eyelashes and you're like on the eyelashes. It's like, do the whole thing,